Hello, everybody. Thank you for being with me here today. We're going to be doing a Bible class about the Bible character Gamaliel. And to give you a little bit of background into why I did this, there was a series that was done at my church, and I was asked to lead one of the lessons. It was a series called Discovering Bible Characters, and we went through some of the lesser known or less famous Bible characters that maybe we don't hear a lot of lessons about. I thought it was a really good series, and it really highlighted some of the people in the Bible that we don't necessarily think about all that often, or we may not have ever heard a sermon on them. And so I thought this was really interesting. These are typically characters that don't get a ton of mention, but are in the Bible a little bit in the background, a little bit, but still have some important contribution to the Bible story. And the individual that we're going to be looking at tonight is no different. So we're going to go ahead and get into that really quickly. So I'm going to go ahead and bring that up. So a couple important things to note about Gamaliel. First of all, I want to make a distinction. There are actually two Gamaliels in the Bible. We're discussing the one that is mentioned in the book of Acts, who lived around the first century, and we'll get a little bit more into his character. There is another Gamaliel that appears, I believe, in the book of Numbers, and he is one of the heads of the tribes of Manasseh. So he's an elder in that tribe, but we're not talking about that Gamaliel. Very little is known about that Gamaliel anyway. The Gamaliel that we're talking about today is someone who features prominently in the New Testament story in chapter 5 of the book of Acts. And there is another mention of him elsewhere, but we're going to get into that in a little bit. So, Gamaliel is one of those characters in the Bible. There's actually a decent amount of information on him that comes from outside of the Bible. And so that's an interesting thing that I got to do with this particular class. And one of the reasons that I picked him is because, one, I do kind of relate to him, and I'll get into that a little bit later, but also because he's one of the few characters in the Bible that there's actually a decent amount of extra biblical material that discusses him. Now, there are certainly other characters in the Bible historical record, and this is one of the proofs that the Bible is a historically accurate book. But Gamaliel is one that there's a decent amount of material for him outside of the biblical canon. So let's go ahead and look at who he was. So, first of all, you have to look at the character of Gamaliel. He's actually got quite a few different titles, and he's known by some different names. So, we have Gamaliel the Elder. This is one that is used to distinguish him from a later Gamaliel that comes after him. And so when we refer to him as Gamaliel the Elder, we just mean that he's the older Gamaliel. He's not one that comes later. He also is in the position of being an elder as a member of the Sanhedrin and the Pharisaical sect. He is sort of considered an elder of Jerusalem, which was a title. And so sometimes this Gamaliel is referred to specifically as Gamaliel the Elder. Kind of going along with that same idea, you have Gamaliel the First. This is to distinguish from Gamaliel the Second. So just like we see in Kings of England or other dignitaries that are in similar positions that have similar names, sometimes you use these titles and number them just like you would a junior or a third in his family. This is no different. Now, Gamaliel's son is not named Gamaliel. He'll actually be mentioned later in the lesson. His name is Simeon. But Gamaliel the first is how we distinguish from the second Gamaliel that comes along later. So that's one of the names you might see of him. And then another one, I thought this was by far the most interesting, Rabbi Gamaliel. So we're all familiar with the title of rabbi. Rabbi is something that Jesus' disciples called him. It's a Jewish title meaning teacher, but rabbon is actually a higher honorary from that. So rabbon is a combination of two Hebrew words, which means teacher, rabbi, and then the other one that means master. And so they kind of mush them together. And so when you say rabbon, what you're referring to that person is as teacher and master. And so he's referred to as Rabban Gamaliel. And the interesting thing about that is this is a title that's fairly rare. You don't see a lot of people referred to as Rabbon. However, this is the first occurrence that we have in the biblical or historic record of anybody ever being called that. So the term Rabbon never occurs in the biblical canon, but we do see it in secular records. And so far as we know, Gamaliel is the first person to ever be called Rabbon. So that's really interesting that they wound up doing that. When it comes to his lineage, this is somebody who did have a lineage. He comes from a family of biblical scholars and prominent people within Judea. And so he is the grandson of Hillel. And for those of you who are unfamiliar with intertestamental history, so the history that happens between the completion of the book of Malachi and the beginning of the Gospel of Matthew, that 400 years, sometimes referred to as the 400 years of silence, that in that particular part of Jewish history, we see a figure raised up known as Hillel. And he is the leader of one of the sects of the Pharisees, and Gamaliel is his grandson. So he's another respected rabbi, cherished within the Jewish community. He's living around the time of the Maccabean revolt, which is how we get Hanukkah. And so he's living sort of in that intertestamental period, and he's a very important figure there. So we see his grandson Gamaliel also holding a place of prominence here in the New Testament times. Also, the Bible actually refers to him as being respected by all the people. So this is somebody with a reputation of respect, of reverence. We'll see a little bit later on that even people who don't necessarily agree with him or like him, they still paid attention to him, heard what he had to say. This is somebody that is well respected by his peers, and even his enemies have to give him some level of respect because of how much he's loved by all the people. And so he enjoyed a very good reputation within his time in the Sanhedrin, and even his political enemies had to give him some sort of deference when it comes to that. And that actually brings us to our next point, which is his politics. He was revered by all, but he was really loved by the common folk more than anything. So just like any other institution like that, he's going to have friends and enemies within there. There's going to be people that theologically disagree with him on some things, but the common people really liked him. And so he's beloved by them. He goes out and teaches, and he teaches the average person, and he breaks down the Torah, the laws, the prophets in a way that the average person could understand. And so he was very well liked by the general public. This is somebody that was very popular in his day and would have been kind of a populist figure within politics. And even with his enemies in the Sanhedrin, like I said, they kind of had to pay him some level of respect because of how liked he was. And so this is somebody that everybody would have known, and his name carried a lot of weight. So when it comes to theology, he is considered the leader of the Hillelites. And if that name sounds familiar, because we just talked about it, it definitely is. So his grandfather, Hillel, kind of founded this one particular sect of the Pharisees. It's kind of like how you have Baptist, and Baptist can be kind of an umbrella term, but within the Baptist, you've got Reformed Baptist, you've got Southern Baptist, you have Primitive Baptist. So you have all these different sort of sects within the larger sect. This is exactly what's going on here. Of course, the Sanhedrin is the Grand Council, but within Judaism, you have the Pharisees and the Sadducees, and the Pharisees also have smaller subgroups within them. He's the leader of the sect of Pharisees known as the Hillelites. So that's an important distinction to make there. When it comes to his theology, like I said, because he was considered the head of the Hillelites, this was the more liberal branch of the Pharisees. Now, remember, we're talking about theologically liberal, not politically liberal. And so this is not necessarily saying his politics are liberal. We're saying that he interpreted certain things in a way that most people would have considered liberal if they were to the right of him in the Pharisee sect. So a good example of this is there's a specific passage in the book of Deuteronomy 24, and Deuteronomy, it gives these laws about marriage, divorce, and remarriage. And you may remember that the Pharisees actually asked Jesus a question about marriage, divorce, and remarriage in Matthew chapter 19, and they were expecting an answer to go back to this debate that was going on in the first century between the Hillelites and the others as to exactly what that meant and how that was supposed to be applied. And the Hillelites interpreted it a little bit more broadly than the other Pharisees that would have been a little bit more strict on it. So there was a cause that was needed for divorce in certain cases, but the Hillelites, they tended to interpret that a little bit more loosely to where there was a little bit more permission given. And so that's just one example. There are many others, but that's just one example of what I mean by he was the more liberal branch of the Pharisees. And it's also important to remember that the Sadducees were seen as the very liberal branch of Judaism. And so he is more liberal within the Pharisee umbrella, but he's the more liberal version of the conservative wing. So This would be kind of like the right-leaning libertarians, if you were to look at it from a political lens. Now, of course, we're looking at it from a theological lens, and so I'm not trying to bring politics into it, just bringing up that this, just to give you some idea of where he fell on the theological spectrum and how he would have been reacted to based on his peers in this particular sect. So when it comes to his students, we know Saul of Tarsus, but that's the only prominent one that we know of. So it's very likely that, especially somebody who's referred to as Rabbon or Rabbi, that he's somebody that had a lot of pupils, a lot of apprentices, but the only one that we know of for sure is Saul of Tarsus. He probably has other ones, but we just don't see them mentioned, or if they are mentioned, it's not mentioned that they were a student of Gamaliel. He probably taught several prominent people that we do have historic records of. It's just that we don't have record of them specifically having studied with Gamaliel. So as far as we know, Saul of Tarsus, who eventually, of course, is sometimes known as the Apostle Paul. He doesn't become an apostle until afterward, but he, as far as we know, didn't have much of a relationship with Gamaliel after he became an apostle when he became a Christian. But that's kind of where we are, and he's the only prominent student that we know of. So the sources that I go to for all of this information are the Mishnah, which is sort of a Jewish religious record of different debates or different interpretations, and that's where a lot of this information comes from. We also see Josephus. So Josephus, for those of you who don't know, is a Jew that he is taken away to Rome in 70 AD when the Romans took over and destroyed the temple at Jerusalem. And so he's kind of hauled away to Rome, but he becomes a historian for the Romans. And so they see him as useful, they keep him around. And because of that, Josephus has a lot of freedom to write some of his own stuff for the sake of recording history for the Romans. And because of that, a lot of this information is coming from Josephus. And Josephus is certainly a lot younger than Gamaliel, but he would have either known Gamaliel or more likely he just knew people that knew him. So he's kind of a secondhand source, which doesn't sound all that impressive, but especially considering the amount of information we have from Josephus and also in the ancient world, secondhand source is actually pretty good. Josephus is a fairly reliable historian that probably would have known quite a bit about Josephus, if nothing else, just knowing his reputation. Then, of course, we have the Book of Acts, and we'll get into that a little bit in just a second. But the Book of Acts is incredibly important as far as understanding who this guy is, but there's a lot more records of him outside of the Book of Acts. And so we're going to look at that piece of information from Acts that we have about him and what we can interpret from that. So here's a quote that's from the Mishnah, and this was written in the first century. So this is written by people who knew Gamaliel. And it says, "When Rabbi Gamaliel the Elder died, the glory of the law ceased, and purity and abstinence died." So that gives you kind of an indication of how much this guy was revered. That they're saying when this guy died, when he was no longer teaching, the glory of the law ceased and purity and abstinence died. I mean, that's very high praise. Now, obviously, they're not saying that literally. They're sort of using hyperbole to make a point, but it does indicate and show us how much he was revered and respected among the Jews and the religious leaders of his time, that they're willing to write something like this to show how much he was beloved and how much he meant to the Jewish community, that his preaching, when it was no longer available to them, they felt that they had suffered a great blow, that they had had a big loss in their religious tradition because no longer having his wisdom around. So let's go ahead and look at the biblical record and some of the things the Bible actually tells us about Gamaliel. So this is an episode where Gamaliel is not speaking, but he is mentioned. So for that, we go to Acts chapter 22, verses 1 through 5. "Brethren and fathers, hear my defense, which I now offer to you." And when they heard that he was addressing them in the Hebrew dialect, they became even more quiet, and he said, "I am a Jew, born in Tarsus of Cilicia, but brought up in the city, educated under Gamaliel, strictly according to the law of our fathers, being zealous for God, just as you all are today. I persecuted this way to death, binding and putting to death both men and women into prisons, as also the high priest and the council of the elders can testify. from them I also received letters to the brethren and started off for Damascus in order to bring even those who were there to Jerusalem as prisoners to be punished. And so, to fully understand the context of what's going on here, this is Paul addressing the Sanhedrin Council. So, this is the High Council of Jews. He's speaking directly to them. That's why you can see in this passage where he starts his defense, he's speaking to them in the Hebrew dialect. So, this is a man who speaks Hebrew. Now, by this point, Hebrew was a dead language, so it wasn't his native language. It was nobody's native language at this point. But the point is, he can speak in Hebrew. Now, it's possible what's actually going on here is that it's referring to Hebrew, but it actually means Aramaic. It doesn't mean actual classical Hebrew. But either way, the point is he is speaking to them in a language. He's not speaking to them in Greek. He's not speaking to them in a foreign language. He's speaking to them in the dialect that they understand. So he's getting their attention by being like, hey, guys, I'm one of you. You know, I can speak this language. He speaks their language. And so he's doing that, and everybody gets quiet and starts paying attention and listening to what Paul has to say. And then he gives this whole testimony about being a Jew, born in Tarsus, brought up in the city. When he refers to the city, he's talking about Jerusalem. So he's like, I am the Jewiest of the Jews. I am very Jewish. I have a Jewish background. I understand you. I speak your language. I was born a Jew. Even though I was born in Tarsus, I was brought up in Jerusalem. I know the culture of the city, and then educated under Gamaliel. What does this tell us about Gamaliel? Well, it tells us that if you were a student of Gamaliel, that is a name that carried weight. Paul would not be bringing this up if this was not a respected person within the Jewish community. He would not be bringing up and name dropping Gamaliel, essentially, if this were not somebody that he believed granted him clout as his Jew. When he's trying to testify to his Jewish bona fides and saying, guys, I'm a Jew just like you. And he's trying to make the case to them that he's not just some wild-eyed heretic that got easily taken away. That's the purpose of what Paul is doing here. This is the reason he's bringing up Gamaliel's name. It matters to the audience he's speaking to. These are people that are in charge of keeping the law of Moses and trying to make sure that others keep the law of Moses. And the thing is, they're probably used to a lot of the people that they are seeing for the exact reason that they're seeing Paul. In other words, they're a false teacher, they're a heretic, they're saying something about the law of Moses that is wrong. They're probably used to the vast majority of those people just not knowing the law very well. Or they're from some far-off province where they're technically Jewish, they're ethnically Jewish, and they may have some Jewish education, but they're sort of taking the scripture out of context or saying things about the law or the prophets that are not true, and that's why they're dealing with this. Paul is putting all of those notions to rest before they even start. He's saying, guys, I'm not some neophyte, I'm not some Johnny-come-lately, I'm not somebody that just suddenly found his Judaism and got easily swept away by some kind of heresy or cult just because I happen to not know the law very well. That's not who he is. I know the law. I know it better than most of you sitting there, probably. I studied at the feet of Gamaliel, which brought him some respect. And I'm telling you, this is not something that I just entered into lightly. In fact, I was the one that was in charge of killing the people that were teaching this because I too believed it was a false teaching. And so he's telling them all of this to build a context for what he's about to say, which is to tell them, this is the way. This Jesus guy that we killed, that was the Messiah. I didn't believe it either at first, but I'm telling you, that's what happened. And so when you're seeing that, when you understand what Paul is doing here and the kind of air he's trying to convey to give them some context for why his conversion is so significant, you understand why bringing up Gamaliel is important here. He wouldn't be bringing this up unless this were somebody that carried a lot of weight in the Jewish community. And here's the other thing too. You'll notice that he says there in verse 5 that he's saying the high priest and all the council of the elders can testify. So when he's addressing them, now this is years later, this is closer to the end of Paul's ministry, whereas obviously the conversion happened before Paul's ministry began. This is probably a few decades, at least a decade or two removed at this point. However, and this is what's important to understand here, when he's bringing this out, He's saying, there's a whole bunch of people sitting in this room that can say that every word that I'm saying is true. For any of you guys that weren't in the Sanhedrin then, but you are now, don't take my word for it. Ask them. And the thing is, there's a pretty good chance that Gamaliel is sitting in the room right now. There's a good chance that Gamaliel, the man who taught Paul and brought him up and instructed him in the ways of the law, is sitting in the audience when Paul is giving this testimony. We don't know that for sure. Maybe he's not. Maybe he was sick that day. Maybe he was off on a journey. Like, we don't know. But the point is, the things that he's saying, these are all things that they could confirm by talking to Gamaliel themselves. He's not boasting. He's not throwing up a false persona. He's not trying to just give himself clout that isn't earned. He's saying, guys, if you don't believe me, ask them. Ask the people that you know that would be able to tell you whether or not this information is true. And so that is a massive confidence boost so that the people that are sitting there know, okay, well, I may disagree with where this guy's conclusion is coming from, but what he's saying about his Jewish credentials, that's 100% true. And so he's dispelling any of those rumors right out of the gate. And that tells us a lot about how much Gamaliel was respected within his community. So with this next passage, we're going to get into the text. And I know I'm going a little bit further back than the part that specifically relates to Gamaliel, but I think it's extremely important to understand the context to get where Gamaliel is coming from and understand the kind of person that he is. Because you have to remember, Gamaliel is not somebody that just pops up randomly in one verse. He's seeing all of this take place, and we'll get into that in a second. So let's go ahead and start reading Acts chapter 5, verses 12 through 16. At the hands of the apostles, many signs and wonders were taking place among the people, and they were all with one accord in Solomon's portico. But none of the rest dared to associate with them. However, the people held them in high esteem. And all the more believers in the Lord, multitudes of men and women, were constantly adding to their number, to such an extent that they even carried the sick out of the streets and laid them in cots and pallets. Sorry, the sick. Did I say the stick? To such an extent, they even carried the sick out to the streets and laid them on cots and pallets, so that when Peter came by, at least his shadow might fall on one of them. Also, the people from the cities in the vicinity of Jerusalem were coming together, bringing the people who were sick or afflicted with unclean spirits, and they were all being healed. So I want to ask you for a second, let this question sit with you for a second. What does this sound like to you? The episode that we just heard, the way the apostles are being described, the way that the people are reacting to them, what does that sound like to you? I mean, to me, it sounds a lot like Jesus. Do you remember that when Jesus would come into a town, when we're reading the account in the Gospels, that you would have people just like coming out into the streets and walking up to him, begging him to heal somebody? Why did they do that? Because they knew that he could. Because his reputation had spread, hey, this guy can heal basically any ailment he wants to. He has authority over that. And we see exactly the same thing happening with the apostles. The people that didn't necessarily have the highfalutin Jewish education, the common people are looking at this and going, look, we don't understand maybe all the theological implications here, but I know that my cousin who's been lame for 15 years, he can walk now. Or my brother who's been blind since an accident when he was 14 years old, and I'm making these scenarios up, obviously, but he used to be blind and now he's not. Like, there are things that are happening that they can't explain. And this has become so prominent, and people are so absolutely convinced because they're seeing it with their own eyes. They're so absolutely convinced of the apostles' power that they're laying people out in the streets hoping that Peter just walks past them and his shadow happens to hit them and that'll be enough to heal them. Well, that reminds me a lot of the woman with the issue of blood. If you recall, when Jesus is on his way to go heal somebody's daughter, he's walking through the crowds and there's this woman that's chasing after Jesus quietly, and she's had a hemorrhage for a number of years, and she just is wanting to grab on to the hem of his garment, and she's convinced that that will heal her. Well, this is very similar behavior to that. People are so convinced of Peter's power and the power that he commands. Now, Peter is telling them that it doesn't come from him. We have that from other passages. But they're so convinced of that they're wanting to just lay their sick there and hope that at some point he walks by and just his shadow passing is enough to heal them. Like, that's a level of respect you don't get without there being some validity to it. And so that's the situation that the Jews and the Sanhedrin are in right now. Now, let's look at how they react to that. Acts 5, chapter 17 through 21. But the high priest rose up, along with all his associates, that is the sect of the Sadducees, because remember, the high priest was a Sadducee, and they were filled with jealousy. They laid hands on the apostles and put them in a public jail. But during the night, an angel of the Lord opened up the gates of the prison, and taking them out, said, "Go, stand and speak to the people in the temple the whole message of this life." Upon hearing this, they entered into the temple about daybreak and began to teach. Now, when the high priest and his associates came, they called the council together, and even all the Senate and the sons of Israel, and sent orders to the prison house for them to be brought. So a couple things that I want to point out here. Again, looking at this passage, sounds a lot like Jesus, doesn't it? Because in the same way that we saw the healings and the people that revere Peter and are wanting him or one of the apostles to just come by and heal them, the Sadducees, the Pharisees, the entire Sanhedrin, the Jewish eldership, everybody, they're reacting exactly the same way, which is now they're jealous. The people are listening to them. They're not listening to us. They revere them more than they do us, and that gives them more power, because the only power that the Sanhedrin had was the power as long as the people were backing it. They understood this, especially considering that they were occupied by Rome at the time. The only power that they had was the control that they had over the people. And now all of a sudden, if the apostles of Jesus are coming around and people are respecting them more than they respect us, that takes away our power. So again, sounds a lot like Jesus. And so in the same way that this passage, I believe, because remember, Luke is also the one who wrote Acts, so he writes the gospel and he writes Acts. Just like we're seeing in the gospel of Luke, there's this reputation that precedes the apostles in the same way that it preceded Jesus. And in exactly the same way, the high priest and the Pharisees, and remember, this isn't long after Jesus is killed. This isn't long after his crucifixion and his resurrection. And so you got to imagine that the conversations that were going on here were, we got to do something about this. We don't want another Jesus situation on our hands. We know what a fiasco that was. We know how it made us look. So now that his followers are going around and doing this and saying that we're the ones that killed him, and that a lot of the things that we're saying about the Bible and about God are wrong, and Jesus really was the Messiah, we better nip this in the bud right now. And that's exactly what they try to do. Because you'll notice what they do is they laid hands on the apostles and put them in a public jail. So the way that the Greek is rendered here, you could actually translate this two different ways. You could translate it as they were put in a public jail, in other words, a jail that was in the public view, or, and this is also a possibility, they put them in a jail publicly. In other words, their arrest was not a secret. They made it a point to go out there, to make a big show of it. They didn't do what they did with Jesus. You remember with Jesus, what they did was they went in the dead of the night and captured him and had a fake mock trial that violated a bunch of their laws and also was sort of out of the public view. They tried to handle the matter secretly. Well, that didn't work out too well for them, to say the least. It did not go as they planned. And so they're going to try something different here. They're like, we got to make sure that the public perception of this goes in our favor. So what we're going to do is we're going to go out there and make it a point to make a big show of it and arrest them. And so all the people know we're the ones with the real power. We've got the actual authority and God's actually on our side. And so because of that, we're going to go out there and we're going to arrest them to make sure nobody else starts talking about this Jesus person. Because we want to make sure that that doesn't happen again. And so they go out, they make a big show out of it. They arrest the guys, they put them in jail. Everybody knows where they are. There's nobody that's wondering, hey, where were those guys that were teaching here the other day? Well, everybody knows that because they saw the arrest publicly. This was big news. And so what you see happen there is that there's a chilling effect on everybody that wants to talk about Jesus. You know, they're going to have to think twice about that because they're like, ooh, if I start talking about Jesus, I might get arrested. And they also just want to show that they're actually the ones with authority. But the officers, this is verse 22, but the officers who came did not find them in the prison. And they returned and reported back, saying, "We found the prison house locked quite securely, and the guards standing at the doors. But when we had opened up, we found no one inside." Now, when the captain of the temple guard and the chief priest heard these words, they were greatly perplexed about them as to what would come of this. But someone came in and reported to them, "The men who you put in prison are standing in the temple and teaching the people." And the captain went along with the officers and proceeded to bring them back without violence, for they were afraid of the people that they might be stoned. So that show of authority didn't quite pan out for them, did it? So they made it a point to, we're going to go out, we're going to make this public, we're going to make sure everybody knows we're the ones in charge, we're the ones with the authority. And if you ever defy us or start talking about Jesus when we told you not to, you're getting arrested. The problem is everybody saw them preaching the next day. And specifically because they made that arrest public, now they're publicly embarrassed. Like if they had just done it secretly and just brought Peter and John and some of the other apostles in and be like, "Guys, don't knock it off." I'm not saying it would have worked. I'm just saying that if they had just sort of privately spoken to them about it and not made it a show and not tried to publicly embarrass them or try to scare everybody that might talk about this, they may not be quite in this particular situation, but they're not. They made a public spectacle of it, and now their public power is being questioned because the men that they arrested and put into jail are now back out teaching the very next day. So it actually backfired on them pretty hard. And I want to pause for a second and talk about this too. Because of that, you would think that there might be, I don't know, a smidge of self-reflection here. Like maybe for a brief moment, they might look at each other and go, is it possible there's something we're missing here? Because we know for a fact we arrested these guys, we put them in the prison, and then this morning, all the doors are locked, the guards are still there, there's no way anybody could have escaped this, and yet they're out here preaching again. Is it possible God might actually be on their side? Is it possible maybe we're in the wrong? No self-reflection whatsoever. All they know is this makes them look bad, and they want to stop it. That is the extent of their concern at this point. And you would think that people whose job it is to actually make sure they're doing God's will would at least consider the possibility that maybe there's an alternative action we could take here that would actually be more conducive to accomplishing our mission of doing God's will. But they don't do that. So here we are. And when you put them in this position and you frame it that way, you start to understand why this becomes such a problem for them. And even in verse 26, you can see that they brought them in without violence, which implies that the arrest yesterday was with violence. So they kind of roughed them up a little bit. They carried them away. They made a big show out of it. Now this time, they're not going to bring them in with violence because they're afraid of the people. So at the very least, the temple guards and the captain of the guard, they're a little afraid because they know that they put these people in jail and now they're out, and the people clearly resonate with that, and now they're afraid of the people. They're not afraid of God. They're afraid of the people because the people do not like this. And so there just doesn't seem to be any self-reflection or even a thought of maybe we should rethink some things. So with that being said, let's go ahead and go to the next passage. When they had brought them, they stood them before the council. The high priest questioned them, saying, "We gave you strict orders not to continue teaching in this name, and yet you have filled Jerusalem with your teaching and intend to bring this man's blood upon us." But Peter and the apostles answered, "We must obey God rather than men. The God of our fathers raised up Jesus, who you had put to death by hanging him on a cross. He is the one whom God exalted to his right hand as Prince and Savior, to grant repentance to Israel and forgiveness of sins. And we are witnesses of these things, and so is the Holy Spirit, whom God has given to those who obey him." Wow. All of that And all of this sign, the council, completely unpersuaded. This is what I've heard people call invincible ignorance, where they are blind to the facts because they refuse to accept the implications of the facts. It doesn't matter what Peter says. It doesn't matter how many signs they have. This is one of the reasons that when people are like, oh, well, if I had lived in the time of Israel and I saw the Red Sea parted, that I would have had faith in God and I wouldn't have worshiped the golden calf. No, you wouldn't. I mean, maybe you would, and I hope you would, genuinely. But I'm not even confident in myself saying that. You know why? Because I understand human nature. And this is human nature on full display. They are so absolutely convinced that they are right, and there's not even an inkling that they might be wrong, that even despite seeing what is clearly a miracle and has no other logical explanation, they just mosey on as though the miracle never happened. Miracles are there for the purpose of instilling faith. But if you have people that are unwilling to listen, there is no amount of miracles that will change their mind. And this is proof of it. And you also have to notice the way that Peter words his response to them. He says, we have to obey God rather than you. And then he basically tells them that they're murderers for putting Jesus to death on a cross, and Jesus is the one who is sitting at God's right hand at this very moment. Now remember that the reason that they're in this position in the first place is because an angel bailed them out of jail. And what did he tell them to do? You go and you teach. You tell them about Jesus. You go back to doing exactly what you were doing that got you arrested in the first place. And Peter says, all right. Doesn't hesitate, right back in the temple the next day. So Peter's essentially telling them, because he knows this, I got orders from God last night. I'm getting contradictory orders from you. So now I have to make a decision. I can't obey both of you. That's impossible. So I've either got to obey you and do what you told me to do, or obey God and do what he tells me to do. I'm going to go with God. That's essentially what he's saying. And so he opts to listen to the angel more than them. It's very hard to come back from that as an argument, even if the guy's wrong. Like if you've ever talked to somebody who believes God speaks directly to them, if they believe that, there's really nothing you can do to convince them otherwise, because they're absolutely convicted in their spirit that God spoke directly to them. And if you know, you can't really do anything to refute that. You have to undermine the idea that God spoke directly to them. Now you can do that, but unless you can convince them of that, you're not going to convince them to not do the thing that they're doing, you know, unless there's somebody who's just disobedient to God like Jonah or something like that. But my point in all of that is Peter has to make that call, and his call is very clear. He'd rather do what God tells them to do than what the Sanhedrin tells him to do. And I wanted to point this out because I know that this is not really the point of our lesson here, because we're supposed to be talking about Gamaliel and we are going to focus on him. But think about Peter for a second. Remember who Peter is. Peter is the apostle that went to Jesus's trial, stood right outside and warmed himself by the fire with some of the people outside of, not the whole Sanhedrin, but part of the Sanhedrin in their questioning Jesus before they crucified him. And you remember that what he does there is he denies that he even knows Jesus 3 times. So this is a man who was so scared of the Sanhedrin that he didn't want them to even know that he knew who Jesus was, much less was one of his closest friends and disciples. And this isn't even to the Sanhedrin directly. These are just people standing around the Sanhedrin outside. And he's so terrified of what the Sanhedrin will do to him, he denies his own Savior. I don't even know who the guy is. He actually says in one of the gospel accounts, I swear by God, I don't know the man. Uses God's name to bolster his claim that he doesn't know who Jesus is. That's how scared Peter is of the Sanhedrin. So who's this guy that we're reading about now? Because that's not the same guy. And we know the Sanhedrin didn't change. Like, if anything, Peter has more reason to fear the Sanhedrin now because he's seen his master at this point be crucified by them. If anything, a sane person would be more afraid of them now. So what changed? Peter changed. Why did Peter change? Because like I said, this is probably only a few months after the crucifixion. What happened to Peter to change his mind that drastically to where a guy that's so terrified of them, he doesn't even want people outside of the court to know that he knows Jesus, to where he's willing to say to their face, you guys are murderers, and I'm going to do what God told me to do and not you, because the Jesus that you're telling me not to talk about, he is the Prince and Savior, the Messiah that we've been waiting for, and he's sitting at God's hand right now and has the power to forgive sins, and you don't. He's saying this to their face while they're threatening him. There's only one explanation for that. There's only one thing that could explain how this transformation happens in Peter. And that is, he saw a man that he knew for a fact died, walking around as though nothing had happened to him. There is no other explanation for that level of change. And to me, that's the strongest, well, maybe not the strongest, but definitely one of the most strong apologetics and proofs that we have that the crucifixion actually did happen, because you don't get a change like this in a matter of months unless something pretty drastic happened. And the only thing that makes that make sense is if Jesus Christ died on a cross, was buried for 3 days, and then was walking around and talking to Peter a few days later. That's the only thing that makes any sense at all. So that's a pretty powerful apologetic. But back to the main point that we're talking about here with Gamaliel. I want you to remember all of this context when we get to Gamaliel's speech, because Gamaliel has seen all of this. And I don't just mean Peter being arrested and them getting out of prison and all that stuff. He's seen all that too. But remember, Gamaliel's also on the Sanhedrin when Jesus is crucified. Now, whether or not he was in favor of that or he was one of the people trying to get him crucified, we don't know any of that. He's not mentioned by name. He's in the council, so he probably approved it. He's at least aware of all the events going on, is what I'm saying. He is sitting in those seats. He is there when a lot of those decisions are made. Maybe he opposed it. We don't know. But the point is, whether he did or not, he knows all of this when he says what he's about to say. So let's go ahead and look at where Gamaliel is. In Acts chapter 5, verses 33 to 37. But when they had heard this, they were cut to the quick and intended to kill them. But a Pharisee named Gamaliel, a teacher of the law, respected by all the people, stood up at the council and gave orders to put the men outside for a short time. And he said to them, Men of Israel, take care what you propose to do to these men. For some time ago, Theudas rose up, claiming to be somebody, and a group of about 400 men joined up with him, but he was killed, and all who followed him were dispersed and came to nothing. After this man, Judas of Galilee rose up in the days of the census, and drew away some people after him. He too perished, and all those who followed him were scattered. So the thing about this is it comports with literally everything we know about Gamaliel from non-biblical sources. Everything we looked at earlier, from Josephus to the Mishnah, all the stuff that we're seeing in the crowd's reaction to him, all of this comports with what we know from the secular history, which is another very strong apologetic for Christianity, that the Bible is a historically accurate record of things that really happened. This is a real person who we have plenty of historic records of outside of that, and everything that we know about him seems to follow right along with the biblical narrative. And so because of that, you can tell that the Bible is a reliable source of history. It is a record of events that did actually happen. And so that to me is just right off the bat a really interesting thing about this. But then when we look in verse 35, I think what has happened here, and I know I'm speculating a little bit, but I think based on the biblical text, this is a sound theory. Gamaliel is at the very least rethinking some things. Now, does this mean that he is fully bought in, that he is on the apostles' side? I don't think that. I don't. But at the very least, he is reconsidering a few things at this point. He is thinking, he's seen this miracle. He's seen all the stuff that happened with Jesus. He's seen what is going on with everything in sort of in the rearview mirror. He's got some hindsight now. He's got some distance from it, and he's seeing these events play out. And he's at the very least thinking, is there a chance that we might be wrong? Is there a chance that maybe Jesus was the Messiah? And maybe this movement actually is something that God is okay with? He seems to be the only person in the room doing that. But at the very least, we can give him credit for at least considering this. And we'll discuss how far that goes and whether or not this meant that he considered it and brought it to its natural conclusion later. I don't know. We'll discuss that in a minute. But I'm saying at this juncture, at the very least, I think it's clear that he, at bare minimum, is considering maybe these guys have a point. And verses 36 and 37, I love this because this is exactly what I would do in his position, and this is why I relate to Gamaliel, is because he's kind of a nerd like me. And as a fellow scholar, what I would do if put in this situation is, let's interpret this through a historic lens. Let's look at things that have happened similar to this in the past or similar to this in the biblical narrative. And let's figure out exactly what we need to do to find the best course of action moving forward. That's very much in line with how I approach things. And so because of that, this is the reason that I kind of relate to Gamaliel, because I see him doing the same thing, trying to logic through it, trying to reason through it logically, trying to look to the past and see how can we use what we know about the past to move forward in the future. And so I do really like that. And let's see the conclusion that he brings us to in the next few verses. So in the present case, I say to you, stay away from these men and let them alone. For if this plan or actions is of men, it will be overthrown. But if it is of God, you will not be able to overthrow them, or else you may even be found fighting against God. They took this advice, and after calling the apostles in, they flogged them and ordered them not to speak in the name of Jesus, and then released them. So they went on their way from the presence of the council, rejoicing that they had been considered worthy to suffer shame for his name. And every day in the temple, from house to house, they kept right on teaching and preaching Jesus as the Christ. So based on this, and now that we have the full speech, I want to ask this question. Is Gamaliel just spooked? Is he just scared that, well, there's a possibility that we could be wrong, so let's just not do anything? I don't think so. And I don't think that he is just making the sheer historic argument, because he goes further than that. This is why I say I think he's at least reconsidering things. Because in these verses 38 and 39, he brings up a point that he probably didn't have to. Because he says, look, we don't know if this plan is of men or of God, but if it is of men, it's going to be overthrown and we don't have to do anything. It'll take care of itself. It'll basically burn itself out. But if it just so happens that they are on God's side, then we don't want to be on the wrong side of God. See, he didn't have to make that last point. He could have just said, look, we've seen this happen historically before. These things always fizzle out. There's no doubt in my mind these guys are false teachers, and so we can just do nothing and let this movement die on its own. He could have made that case. He doesn't. He leaves them with at least the possibility, maybe we should consider that maybe they're on God's side. Now, that's pretty radical. And he probably could have got the outcome that he wanted, which is for them to just leave these guys alone and not punish them, if he had just made the first case. But he also goes on to say, and maybe there's a possibility these guys are on God's side. I don't think you do that if you're just trying to get an outcome that you want. I think he really is considering these things. I think he's really making the case that maybe we ought to think about this for a second. Now, the case that he makes is logically very sound. In case A, problem resolves itself. We don't have to do anything. Why would we bend over backwards and possibly draw the ire of Rome and get the people not on our side when this thing's just going to fizzle out anyway? And then there's also case B, which is, well, if we oppose them and it turns out that they are right, then we lose. We're going to be overtaken by them, and we're not going to be able to overthrow them, and we would actually be on the losing side. And so logically, his case is very sound. He's like, if we persecute them and it's case A, it just fizzles out. If it's case B, we lose. So it just makes more sense for us not to act. Logically, it's very sound. Theologically is a different story, and I'm going to get to that in a second. But logically, this is a very logical course of action. It just makes sense not to do anything to them and let's just see where it goes. But in verse 40, I don't know if Gamaliel would have agreed to the flogging, because remember that he said to just be careful what you do to them and leave them alone. I don't think he even agreed with that. But the point is, their happy medium was to just flog them, which is like a weird middle ground to reach. But anyway, I'm sure they didn't feel like it was a middle ground when they were being flogged. But the point is, they do sort of compromise and go to, okay, we're not going to kill them, we're not going to arrest them, but we are going to punish them and humiliate them and then send them on their way. So that's where they go. I don't think Gamaliel would have approved of that just based on his speech, but at the very least, he didn't fight them on that, at least not that we know of. So he's just going to kind of let that play out, because he at the very least kept them from trying to kill them. So there's a series of questions here I want us to ask ourselves, and I'll give you a second to think about it. If you want more time, just feel free to pause the video and think about it. What does this whole episode tell us about Gamaliel? How he reacts to this? What does it tell us about his personality? One thing I think that you could bring up, and these were the answers I came up with, so feel free to fill in your own. He is more humble than most of the people in the room. Now, he's somebody that sits in a place of prestige. He's somebody that when he spoke, people paid attention because they thought his words were important. And yet, despite all of that, he still seems like a pretty humble guy, because he's willing to say, maybe we're wrong. Maybe we should consider what they have to say. Maybe we'll actually be the ones that it turns out are fighting against God. And so maybe we should be a little bit more careful about what we do. That takes a level of humility. Academic humility, intellectual humility, theological humility, humility before a God that he understands as God and he's not. He's also a lot more open. He's at least willing to consider, because remember, even the Sadducees, who are the more liberal theological side of the argument, they're the ones that are actually saying that we should kill these people. We don't even want to consider that they might be right. That's not even a thought to us. We never even considered that maybe there might be something to this. And so he's at the very least more open to ideas than they are. And another thing I think it shows about him is he has a pretty strong faith, because he believes if this is something that God wants to happen, it's going to happen whether we want it to or not. Like, if God has decided that he's on these people's side and this is what he actually wants to happen, then we can oppose it all we want to. It won't do us a lick of good. That's somebody that has a strong faith. He believes that if God wants it done, it's going to happen. There's nothing he can do to stop it. And that is somebody that really does have a correct view, a correct piety when it comes to approaching a holy and all-powerful God. Let's look at question 2. Is Gamaliel's advice theologically sound given his position? Actually, I think no. Like I said, it is logically sound. There's no question that his two premises do necessitate his conclusion, therefore logically sound. Here's the problem, though. It ignores the question that considers the viability of Peter and John's claims. It's sort of a way to get around the fact that they have to deal with the fact that now there's someone claiming to be the Messiah. It does not hit at the theological core of the question they need to resolve. Because here's the thing. Can you ever think of a time in the Bible, and I'm talking about Old Testament, New Testament, whatever, where God's just cool with false teaching and false prophecy abounding and God's people doing nothing about it? Because I can't. In fact, I remember Moses' instructions in the book of Deuteronomy, where if a prophet says something and says it's from God, and he makes a prediction that he says is a prediction from God, and it turns out to not come to pass, what you should do to that person is stone them. Like, you should be put to death for claiming to speak for God when you don't. Biblically, that is the correct view. And ironically, Saul's position, remember Saul, who becomes Paul eventually? I mean, I won't get into the name change thing, but that's not actually how it happened. But you remember that the Apostle Paul is there standing, making sure that none of Stephen's blood gets on the priests because it would make them unclean while they're stoning him to death for teaching in the name of Christ. Now, I'm not saying it was the right thing to do. Paul will also tell you, as we saw earlier, that that's not the right thing to do. But the point is, given the position that he's in, that is actually the more theologically sound position, that you stone anybody that is teaching something that you believe is false. Now, the difference is, and the reason that's not correct is because what they were teaching was actually true. That's what makes the difference. But my point is, Saul's position of you take out the false teachers, according to the Old Testament, not the New Testament, but according to the Old Testament, that is the correct method you do to handle false teaching. That is more theologically in line with the Old Testament, and actually it's more theologically in line with the New Testament. Now, the New Testament doesn't necessarily say that you stone or kill false teachers, but it does say that you have to be pretty ardent in opposing them. You can look at Elijah, who killed 450 priests of Baal. You can look at the book of Ezekiel in Ezekiel 33, where he drives out the false teachers. Ezekiel 33 talks about the watchman, where if there is false teaching going on and you don't warn the people, then their blood is on your hands. You're held accountable for their false teaching if you don't stop it. And so, theologically speaking, I think Gamaliel's advice is actually bad advice. It's logically sound. It's not theologically sound. That's my position. I think that it's the correct one. Now, question 3. What influence from Gamaliel do you see in Paul? When you think about Paul, think about his writings, think about his epistles, think about what we know about Paul. What do you see from Gamaliel in Paul? I think there's a lot there, actually. First of all, he's a trained rhetorician because he considers multiple possibilities and how each of them turn out. That's classic Greek logic and rhetoric. He is looking ahead. He's trying to see what's the best position we can put ourselves in. What about this possibility? What happens if this winds up happening? Like he's able to do multidimensional thinking and be able to convey that in a rhetorically palatable way. He can convey his ideas well. Paul does that all the time. Paul does that especially in his letters to Corinth. He does it in the book of Romans quite a bit. And so you can see that at least some of the teaching that Gamaliel gave him really prepared Paul for the work that he was doing. And so regardless of whether Gamaliel ever fully bought into the idea of Jesus or not, he greatly contributed to Christianity, if nothing else, just by training arguably its most important evangelist. And Paul is certainly the apostle to the Gentiles. So him being able to do that and to speak their language and to be able to understand Greek logic and be able to speak to so many different crowds and be able to speak from their perspective, like that's something that you don't just have. You have to be trained to do that. And it's clear that Gamaliel did his job in preparing Paul for that. Now, maybe Gamaliel did it unwittingly. Probably did. I'm guessing he had no idea that his student would eventually become a Christian apologist. But the point is, whether he did or not, God was using him for his purpose at the time. Also, there's a great deal of humility and openness that does lead Paul to convert. I know that Paul was kind of stunned into converting. He was blinded on the road to Damascus, but he still had to be at least open enough to take that and to understand he was doing the wrong thing. God would not have approached him if he didn't have that level of openness to at least admit that maybe he's wrong about something. And Paul does admit that he's wrong about a lot of things, or at least was wrong about a lot of things when we see him as a Christian. And so that humility and openness that Gamaliel had, eventually that leads to Paul having a similar humility and openness. And I'm not saying he didn't learn it from other sources either, but I think he learned a lot of that from Gamaliel. There's also an assumption of God's rightness and justice. Because you remember that Gamaliel is taking the stance of, look, guys, if we're wrong, God's going to do what he's going to do. And then we're going to be on the wrong side of that. Gamaliel assumes that whatever side God is on is right. He's not the one that decides what right and wrong is. That's God's decision. And if he's on the opposite side of God, then he's the one that's in the wrong. Same is true for his sense of justice. If God does it, it's just. His morality comes from a God-centered universe. And so does Paul's. We can see that especially in Romans chapter 1. We see it a lot in the book of Colossians. We see it especially in his pastoral epistles. And so we're seeing a lot of Gamaliel's influence in Paul. And I think that if nothing else, Gamaliel's contribution to Christianity was great because of that. So this brings me to my final question, which is, did Gamaliel become a Christian? And this is a hotly debated topic, especially among Catholics, because Catholics actually hold him as a saint. They refer to him as Saint Gamaliel. But there is some historic back and forth as to whether or not he actually converted. So at the very least, based on what we know from the book of Acts, he does seem open and sympathetic to the idea of the Christian movement. Doesn't mean he converted, but it does mean he at least shows some level of sympathy and respect for it. We also have Clement of Rome in his book Recognitions of Clement, which happens, it would have been chapter 165 through 66. He claims that both he and his son Simeon were secretly baptized by Peter and John after the Acts 5 incident. Now, why is that important? Clement of Rome is an extremely well-respected figure in the early church. Now, he is not the first generation. He's not an apostle or anything like that. But Clement is somebody who lived in the first century. So he either knew Peter directly or he knew people that knew Peter. And because he's living in Rome, there's a good chance that he met both Peter and Paul. And remember Paul's relationship with him. And so the idea that he became a saint being presented by Clement of Rome, who would have either known these men directly as a very young man, like a teenager, or knew people that did know them, that's pretty powerful. And that is good evidence that there's a chance that this man really did become a Christian secretly. He claims, among other things, that he kept his faith, Gamaliel, kept his faith a secret to help Christians from the inside. So basically, he stayed in the Sanhedrin. He didn't make his Christianity public so that he could strategically help Christians that were being persecuted by the Sanhedrin. He also claims that Peter once referred to him as a brother in the faith. And again, this is somebody who either knew Peter directly or knew people that knew Peter. Clement also is an early source. So he lives from 35 AD, so right after Jesus is crucified, to 99 AD, which again means that Peter and Paul would have been in Rome about the time that he's a young man. And so it's possible that he knew them directly. And at the very least, the people that would have been the elders at the church there in Rome, that would have ran in the same circles as him, would have gotten direct instruction from both Peter and Paul and John. And maybe some of the other apostles as well. Maybe even epistles that we no longer have preserved that are lost to the annals of time. They may have even had extra instruction from him that we don't know about. And so if Clement says it, it carries a lot of weight. However, and this is the other side of that, the Talmud, the Jewish religious record, records him as being a devout Jew when he died. So there's never any indication that he converted. There was never any indication that he became a Christian or anything like that. According to them, he was just a devout Jew and respected member of the Sanhedrin upon his death. And that is evidence that maybe he didn't convert. But here's another thing to consider. Christianity and Judaism are not mutually exclusive. You might remember in Acts chapter 21, verses 19 through 26, actually right before the speech where Paul mentions Gamaliel, that he was taking a Nazirite vow. That's part of the old law. This is years after Paul has become a Christian. So a lot of people, they make the mistake of thinking that once the first century Jews became Christians, they became Christians and they weren't Jews anymore. It's not true. Christianity and Judaism are not mutually exclusive. You can be a Christian and still engage in Jewish rituals. You can still have a Jewish diet. You can still follow the Sabbath, for example. You can do all of those things. Now, one thing you couldn't do is participate in the sacrifices, because at this point we have one sacrifice, and that's Christ. So there are certain things you can't do. But my point is, you didn't have to abandon everything about your Jewish culture or heritage or religion to become a Christian. There are several things you could participate in as a Jew and still be a Christian. These things are not mutually exclusive. And part of the reason that Paul did this is to show, guys, I'm a Christian, yes, but I'm not a Jew now. Like, I still believe in the old law. I still follow the old law. I'm not hostile towards your traditions or your rituals. It's part of my heritage too. So I don't think there's anything about the Talmud saying that he died as a devout Jew that means that he couldn't have also been a Christian. So that brings us to our final question, which did Gamaliel actually convert to Christianity? So as I see it, there's one major problem with this. Can you be a secret Christian? Have you ever heard of a secret Christian? Doesn't Jesus say that you have to confess my name before men, and I will confess your name before God? And isn't it also isn't it also Jesus that when he talks about confessing your sins one to another, he also talks about professing your faith? That you have to be vocal and open about it, that he gives us a command in the Great Commission to go out and tell the world and baptize them in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. We have to preach them all things. Well, if that's the case, how can you be a secret Christian? Wouldn't that be a violation of that commandment? But again, Clement of Rome would have known all of that. He would have known Jesus' teaching. He would have memorized those things. Probably would have known them better than us. Just because he had to internalize it and memorize it, because there's no like Bible app he can go to or copy of the Bible that he can read. And so Clement knows all of those things. So how did Clement even decide that it was prudent to claim that Gamaliel was a secret Christian if he believed that a secret Christianity would have been immoral? I don't know. But when Clement says something, we ought to take it seriously, because he's been shown to be a reliable source on a lot of different things. So there are things that I think lean me more in the camp towards him not becoming a Christian. But Clement saying that he did is pretty strong evidence. And what we have from the biblical record does indicate that he was at least open to the idea. So the final thing that I have to leave you with today is, to be honest, I don't know. I don't know if he became a Christian or not. It doesn't really affect my faith one way or the other, whether he did or didn't. Whether he did or not, we see a lot of things that are important. We see a lot of things that he contributed to Christianity, even if he never became a Christian himself. We see a man who had humility and was open to God's will and was willing to be proven wrong. And that says a lot about him. So whether or not he actually became a Christian, I don't think we'll ever know. But the point is, he's an interesting character. He's included in the Bible for a reason. And I think just as a general rule, going beyond even Gamaliel here, it's important for us to remember that things that might seem like background occurrences or people that are background characters in the Bible, those are all real people too. And they had souls and they had lives that they lived. And there are lessons to be learned from them, as I think I've proven today with how much there is to learn from Gamaliel, despite the fact he's not mentioned very much in the Bible. There's people with even less mentions in the Bible that I think their lives and what little we know about them speaks volumes from God's word. And so some of us, we're never going to be famous. Our names aren't going to be in the Bible. But that doesn't mean we can't be important to some people. And that doesn't mean we can't be important to the kingdom. And who knows? Maybe our contribution will just be one person that we taught goes out and converts thousands or millions of people. We can't know that. I'm sure Gamaliel didn't know that he was being used by God, and maybe he never even became a Christian. He might be in hell today. Whether he was or not, the work that he was doing was important. And God used him and used his skill and used his knowledge and used his character qualities and everything about him to forge the Apostle Paul, who we're still reading to this very day because of the contributions that he made to the faith. And so never think that because you're not famous or because you're not doing these big grandiose things, that what you're doing doesn't matter. God can use anybody. He brought down the biggest, most powerful nation on planet Earth with one shepherd and a stick. He took down an armored giant with a rock. Like, if God can do that, he can do pretty amazing things with you. So never forget that. Never forget that there is a God who loves you and he has a plan for you within his kingdom. Now, it might be a really big part of the plan. It might be a very small part of the plan. But that's the thing about it. When it comes to God's plans, they all contribute to the same goal anyway. And he's just as pleased with us, whether we're contributing a big part or a small part, as long as the part that we're doing is what he asked us to do. So that's going to be it for me today. Thank you so much for your time and attention, and stay the course, friends.